Today we're going to talk about some of the sweet spot when it comes to building a gaming computer. So every time I go to Micro Center now, I'm kind of shocked by the amount of people that are there building systems right now. And I think that's because they're trying to head off a lot of the price increases that could be coming any day now. But anyway, today we're going to talk about, like I said, some of the sweet spots so you don't overspend in certain areas and you spend your money where it matters most. Enhance your professional monitor setup with the ViewSonic VP27885 5K, featuring 100% sRGB, 99% DCI P3 colors, and HDR 400 for deep contrast that align perfectly with Mac's industry-leading color performance. The VP27885 5K supports laptops, PCs, Macs, and more with Thunderbolt 4, USB-C, HDMI DisplayPort, and USB inputs. If you're looking to increase your screen real estate for projects, click the link in the description for more. It's been a while since we've done one of those baseline builds with the same tier product versus the high-end boutique-y build of the same tier products, bringing same CPU, same exact class of motherboard, like let's say Z790 versus the cheapest one versus the expensive one, with the exact same, say, graphics card with the cheapest MSRP model versus the most expensive custom AIB model, which could cost $500 to $1,000 more just because of its custom design. As you can see, it's really easy to kind of get lost in the mix of all the different products that are available. So today we're gonna go through each category and sort of try and make it a little bit simpler for you to decide where you should be spending your money. So first and foremost, let's talk about the platform, specifically the CPU. It's really hard to argue still with the fanboyism of saying AMD. But AMD has made such huge strides on their CPUs, especially when it comes to value and performance. Back in the day with AMD, you got value at the cost of performance. Today you can have both with AMD. I know as shilly and sponsored as this sounds, that's not the case here. It's just right now Intel has not had anything to truly compete against the amazing Ryzen platform. And that includes AM4 all the way up through AM5. But in terms of which CPU to buy, a lot of people can get very confused on that. Now, unless you're shopping top tier and you're looking at building the most ultimate gaming PC, you don't need a 9800 X3D, you don't need a 9950 X3D, heck, you don't even need a 7800 X3D. In fact, if you're not planning on going with a high-end graphics card, you're kind of throwing away money by going with an X3D CPU because of the fact that you won't actually ever induce any sort of a CPU bottleneck if you're not running the fastest GPU available. Now, there are uplifts across the board on an X3D with the extra cache on the CPU, even if you're running a mid-range or even a low-end CPU. But the thing is, it's not going to make sense to pair a high-end X3D CPU with a mid-tier GPU, because I would rather kind of swap that money and go a little bit higher on the GPU and still go with a non-X3D CPU like a 7800X or a 9800X or 9700X. I mean, these are amazing CPUs that are significantly less expensive and would have a very hard time noticing the difference between an X3D CPU and a non-X3D CPU if you're building a modest gaming PC. Now, if you're gonna throw something like a 5090 on there or a 4090 or heck, even like a 7900 XTX, then you might notice actual more performance by going with an X3D CPU. But if you're shopping top tier, top of the line as it is already, this video is kind of already not for you. So, like I said, there's no real Intel, in my opinion, even with a bundle deal or something like that, that really competes with what AMD has to offer right now in terms of value and performance. They've gotten way more stable. They're much better with the Expo profiles for RAM. The RAM has gotten faster. I mean, modern 9000 series CPUs for AMD, even on an older X670E platform, are running 8000 megahertz DIMMs, no problem whatsoever, where just a couple years ago, that was kind of a pipe dream. But when it comes to Intel, there's just truly not a lot to compare with, because if you were going to run something like a 9800X or 9700X, now you're shopping 14600K, 14700K. I'm not even saying Core Ultra 265K or anything like that, because we already know Core Ultra, just being the first gen of a chiplet-ish design that Intel has, it's just not competitive at the price. So it's not even worth going. But another way it's easy to overspend is going to be the motherboard. Now, for instance, right here, I have two different Z790 boards that would obviously be 12th, 13th, and 14th gen Intel. But we have here an MPG Z790 Carbon Wi-Fi, and there's an Asus Strix behind it. Both are Z790 chipsets. Both are going to give you overclocking capabilities. Both are going to give you, your Gen 5 PCI Express, multiple M.2 slots, built-in Wi-Fi, built-in fast NICs. But they're going to be vastly different on price. But both of these would actually be overkill, and we're going to apply the same logic to AMD as well, because of the fact that unless you're planning on overclocking your CPU, and trying to get every ounce of performance out of it, you don't have to go with the top tier chipsets. Like for instance, a B650 for AMD is going to give you the exact same experience as a X670E. Obviously, we're talking older gen, like we talk B850 versus X870E platform, which is the newest for AM5. Unless you're planning on turning on PBO and trying to go for, crazy overclocks and stuff, there's really no reason to spend the several $100 premium it's gonna cost to go with that chipset. You're gonna get the same level of RAM stability, you're gonna get the same amount of lanes to your CPU, you're gonna get the same amount of M.2 support. It's just extra money for really phantom gains that you're probably never ever gonna notice. So I would highly recommend, like if we were talking about a mid-range or a modest gaming PC that doesn't break the bank, something like a 9700X with like a B650 motherboard would absolutely be a killer rig. Now when we talk about drives, you don't need to run a Gen 5 drive. It's nice to look at those numbers and say, I've got 14,000 megabytes per second of read speed, meaning your games load super fast and then your programs pop up super quick. But you know what? If I were to put a Pepsi versus Cola challenge, if you would, with a Gen 5 drive versus a Gen 4 drive, you would be very hard pressed to notice the difference in day-to-day use. Unless you're loading large files, when it comes to seeking for smaller files on these drives, that's where the differences definitely get narrower. So I would say it's definitely worthwhile to consider going with a more modest Gen 4 drive with more capacity to you, than going with a faster Gen 5 drive with a lower capacity that's gonna be around the same price. Now, Gen 3, now we're talking a little old at this point. I mean, they're 3,500 megabytes per second, kind of maxed out on read speed. 3,500 versus 7,000 to 8,000, which you get on Gen 4. I mean, we're talking double the speed. I think Gen 4 is still the sweet spot. Like personally, I would go with a 2 terabyte Gen 4 drive all day long from a reputable brand. That way you know the controller is good and the NAND is good. And then obviously read consumer reports of people talking about whether or not their drives have failed or whatnot. So obviously we've got like Micron or Crucial, you've got Samsung, SK Hynix makes direct to consumer brands now, a brand of SSDs. And now if you know this, SK Hynix is one of the largest chip manufacturers in the world regarding memory and NAND. In fact, you might pop open another brand and see SK Hynix on the NAND itself, even though the brand is something else. So it's kind of like a lot of these ODMs start to just sell direct now, and you can kind of cut out the middleman, which is kind of nice. That's why we've been using SK Hynix drives lately. We're having a lot of fun with them because they're cost competitive and they're direct to the manufacturer. Now let's go ahead and talk about, when we're talking about memory and RAM and all that, let's talk about memory real quick. So when it comes to a gaming PC, it's fun to max out to the numbers, right? As gamers, we're kind of like min-maxers. It doesn't matter what kind of game you're playing. Min-max is the meta. All the buzzwords in this video. But you are gonna really have a hard time noticing 8,000 megahertz DIMMs versus say 6,000 megahertz DIMMs when it comes to your game. And technically, the lower mega transfers you would find, like for instance, 6,000 to 6,400 mega transfers at say CL30 or CL28, in more cases is gonna actually perform better than say faster RAM at 7,800 to 8,400 megahertz with much looser timing so that you have stability at the fast mega transfers. In fact, the most expensive, tightest timing RAM that you can find at say 8,000 megahertz is gonna actually be slightly slower on latency than say a 6,000 megahertz RAM set at CL28. So 6,000 mega transfers to 6,400 mega transfers at CL28 to CL30 is gonna kind of be your sweet spot in terms of performance. Now, I'm not talking about it being the cheapest RAM set. Obviously, you can find cheaper RAM by going, say, 6,000 mega transfers and like CL36 or something like that. And you still would have a hard time noticing the difference. But for a nominal price increase, you can get those timings a little tighter. So if you were sitting there shopping for RAM right now, brands that we're really liking right now, Team Group, the new Team Group stuff has been pretty awesome. It's what's in my rig. G.Skill Flare X has always been kind of like an industry staple when it comes to gaming RAM. In fact, you'll find G.Skill has most of the no frills, all function, less form RAM that's out there at a very price competitive. So like, for instance, you can see right here the Flare X, oops, down goes the CPU. You can see the Flare X has no RGB or anything on it, and they do obviously have G.Skill Flare X with RGB and whatnot. It's the Trident, technically, the Trident Z stuff. Just make sure that you're getting a set that is QVL'd for your particular motherboard. For instance, now you have Expo specific RAM, which will run on Intel, and you have Intel XMP 3.0 profiles, which will run on AMD. but they're not specifically designed for those platforms. And more often than not, these brands now make RAM kits that are like tailored to the platform you're building to give you the best performance possible for that platform. So rather than having multiple profiles, it's like, well, we got to make this caveat to make it work on Intel and AMD. So here are these kind of like looser profiles. Just make sure you're pairing Expo RAM with AMD and you're pairing Intel XMP RAM with Intel, because you will find what look like two identical sets of G.Skill Flare X next to each other, but one will say AMD and one will say Intel. So just make sure you're pairing that, and you really don't need to go higher than 6,000 to 6,400 megatransfers, and just keep the timings as tight as possible that's within your budget. Now that we've talked about motherboard, we've talked about CPU, we talked about RAM, let's talk about keeping it cool. Your cooler should scale with not only the CPU that you were planning on building or buying or using, but potentially future upgrades you might make. It's easy to say, well, I'm just gonna get a $25 or $30 cooler right now because I'm only running a 9700X. It's only a 85 watt CPU or whatever it is. And then obviously with the 105 watt mode, you can push it up a little bit higher. Just about any air cooler on the market today can support 105 watts. Now keep in mind, under full load conditions, it actually draws a bit more than 105 watts. It's actually more like 125, 130. But again, every modern air cooler today can handle that type of wattage. But let's say in the future, you come across some extra money or you get a promotion at work or whatever, and you're like, I want to build myself a higher end gaming CPU now, or system now. And you're going to change out your CPU maybe with just popping out the 9700X and popping in like a 9950X3D. Now we're talking significantly more power, power draw, heat than something like a 9700X. So you want to make sure that you're not now having to buy a new cooler to go along with that. So I would personally oversize the cooler a little bit, but I would probably stick with an air cooler versus any sort of AIO today because of how good the air coolers are getting. Like for instance, we did a review on this right here. This is the Thermalright Phantom Spirit 120 Evo. It is a twin tower cooler. It's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 copper vapor chamber pipes. It is actually extremely capable and would be able to keep something like a 9950X or 9950X3D cool for long gaming sessions, even if you live in a warm environment, due to the fact that it's got 2 fans on here. It's got a huge heat sink on it. I know it sounds like an ad. It's just for $59, you would have to spend at least $100, $150 on an AIO to get similar cooling performance or better cooling performance than this. Not to mention when it comes to maintenance, it's just fans. Even if your fans failed, the heatsink will still sink heat away from your CPU. If your pump fails in your AIO, your system starts shutting down because the thermal runaway happens so quickly. Your system goes into a thermal protection where it will shut down the whole system because the CPU just ran away and went beyond its TJ max temperature, and then it saves itself by shutting down the system. So even if your fans failed, and usually fans give an indicator that they're gonna fail, you start getting some rattling or you start noticing it slowing down or you might notice it twitching, you just pop new fans on there and you're up and running in no time. So the amount of cooling capability you can get on companies now that are kind of shaking up the entire air cooling industry, it's really hard to argue against a nice beefy air cooler and its reliability over something like a water cooler. Now later on, if you decide to go with like a high-end AIO, screens and all that sort of stuff, there's a huge diminishing return because the cheapest 360 AIO built on an Asetek patent is gonna perform exactly the same as the most expensive 360 AIO also built on the Asetek patent, because the only thing different is on top of the pump, usually it's screens and lights and all that other crap. So you're gonna get the same cooling performance, you're just paying for extra frills, and that's up to you to decide if that's worth it to you later. Let's go ahead and talk about power supply, because now that we've got our platform chosen, we've got our coolers chosen, we've got to make sure we're supplying enough power. And this is an area where people tend to, I think, quite often have a different opinion than I do on this. For instance, I always overspec my power supply for multiple reasons. Depending on the wattage range you're looking at, going from something like an 850 watt power supply to a 1000 watt power supply is not a huge jump in price, but it's a huge jump in forward compatibility in terms of sizing up your power supply or your graphics card in the future, sizing up your CPU in the future. If you go from a modest build to a more hardcore build, the power and heat exponentially go up with that cost. So if you have a power supply today that's spec'd to what your graphics card, and this is the most power consumption piece in your system, is going to be your graphics card. Most people will just look, what's the minimum spec I can get away with? Oh, a 750 watt. Okay, I'll get that. Well, now you're stuck, because if you want to upgrade your GPU in the future, now you got to upgrade your power supply to go along with it. And let's face it, graphics cards are getting very power hungry these days. The days of a 250 watt Halo card are long gone. You have 250 watt 70 tier cards now. Okay, it is crazy how power hungry graphics cards are getting. And that's just because of what's happening as the process shrinks. It gets really, really dense, and Moore's Law is kind of in shambles right now, in that it's kind of not following the typical trends, where right now power is kind of like exponentially going up with performance, where Moore's Law talks about a doubling of performance. Anyway, we can talk about Moore's Law later. But I would always overspec my power supply at least one whole tier above. And what do I mean by that? Let's say I have a Nitro 9070 XT right here. If it talks about system recommendations, it says minimum 750 watt or greater power supply. I would go with a minimum 850 watt for that. Now, even that might limit us to what the next tier up would be. Now, obviously we know 9070 XT is the highest AMD has to offer today. We don't know what the future holds. Let's say they come out with a 9090 XT and suddenly it's like minimum 850 watt. Well, guess what? If you got an 850 watt at the time you built your system by spending an extra 40 to 50 bucks, now you don't have to spend an extra $200 or $175 later on top of the price of your graphics card. So I think it makes sense personally to just overspec your power supply, because it's one of the things you will hang on to the longest in your system. Platforms change often, because oftentimes, unlike AMD, which has actually kept AM4 alive for many, many years, and the promise of AM5 is there as well, Intel's one of those that, like every other generation, like to change a couple of pins in the socket, and suddenly you've got to have a whole new motherboard to go with your platform. But power supplies, they can just continue to live on. And in fact, I've got a 1600 watt EVGA power supply on the test bench over there that is easily going on 8 years old, that is currently powering an XOC 5090, because it's a 1600 watt behemoth that absolutely doesn't go obsolete, because 1600 watts is 1600 watts. So I think you should overspec your power supply personally. Now, if I were looking at a graphics card that's 750 or 850 watt, I would probably personally find something like a gold, 80 plus gold 1000 watt. Because another way you can easily overspend and jump out of that sweet spot is with the power supply rating. So wattage is only half of the equation. Now we're gonna keep like cybernetics aside. That's a whole new way of measuring power supplies. We're gonna stick with 80 plus. It's what a lot of people understand. There is a major jump in cost. I'm going something like 1000 watt 80 plus gold versus 1000 watt 80 plus platinum. And don't get me started on 80 plus titanium. These are efficiency ratings. And the jump from gold to platinum is only a few percent of efficiency. That few percent is costing you more than a few percent of cost increase. So 80 plus gold is really where you should be shopping. Like what we have right here are two 1000 watt power supplies. One is an 80 plus titanium and one is an 80 plus gold. So I personally feel like gold is where you should stick. It's the gold standard. I did it for you guys. Yeah, so I would just overspec the power supply, because it's gonna live the longest in your system. Let's talk graphics cards. What a time to be a PC gamer. And I don't mean that in a good way. Because graphics cards have gotten exponentially more expensive generation on generation. For instance, this 9070 XT Nitro Plus is more than $1,000, when the MSRP on this card is something like $750, somewhere around there. I can't remember the exact price. Phil can put it here if I'm wrong. This would be a terrible value if you're getting a 9070 XT. It has a lot of really cool functions. It actually runs a 12 volt high power, which is kind of neat for keeping it clean, especially since it routes through the card and hides. We're paying a premium for that. It's got awesome RGB functions on there. It's an overclocked card. It's a giant cooler, meaning it's very quiet and very big. These are things that are not going to necessarily translate into tangible performance differences that you can notice. Because as we have already tested, 9070 XT MSRP models and 9070 XT AIB models are very close in performance because of the boost logic built into the GPUs, NVIDIA as well, with GPU boost. They already pushed the cards beyond the base specs that are on them if power limit isn't hit and thermal limit isn't hit. So they're self-overclocking as it is. So it's really hard to justify buying a $1,000 plus 9070 XT when an $800 one is going to absolutely give you, within 3 to 5% of the exact same performance. That price difference pays for that power supply you need to run it. So sweet spot for me is, I would say, as close to MSRP as you can get, because that itself is a statement today. But if you're shopping NVIDIA though, the closest card to this is gonna be something like a 5070 Ti. And these things trade blows quite often, and 5070 Ti's are also gonna cost you anywhere between that $850 to $1,000 price point. Yeah, we're talking 70 tier cards that are $1,000. You can see why I'm saying what a time to be a PC gamer. But don't discount finding either previous gen stuff that might be available, potentially lightly used, maybe open box, because something like a 4070 would be an amazing GPU today still. It's got 16 gigabytes of VRAM, and you can find them significantly less than what 70 tier stuff costs new for 50 series right now. It's the only piece that I would probably recommend trying to find a used one that you can really feel confident in, because of the fact that GPUs are still so astronomically overpriced today. But it's kind of crazy, man. We talked to some of the salesmen at Micro Center, especially when we were at Santa Clara, and the amount of GPUs, brand new ones that are walking out the door every single day, and they're still outselling NVIDIA with AMD right now. 9070 XTs, when they're available, are selling faster than NVIDIA counterparts. I know this sounds extremely AMD shilly. It's just the situation they have created, which is actually listening and trying to create better products. I just wish our graphics cards were, on average, cheaper. But I mean, we all want 5090 performance at $200, right? Who would not want that? So I would say right now buying anything new is gonna be a difficult sell in terms of sweet spot, especially if you're shopping on a budget. Now, we were able to build a $2,500 system when we did the Santa Clara build with a 9070 XT. And I think right now, anywhere between $2,000 to $2,500 would get you a high-end, ready to go system that absolutely would last years and years in the future with an upgrade path available to it. And that $2,500 system also used much higher end parts than we're talking about today. So you could still even spend $1,500 to $2,000 and build yourself a pretty powerful gaming system by utilizing some of these standards that I'm talking about right now with sticking within those sweet spots. Because a $1,500 system can quickly turn into a $3,000 system and give you no extra performance, simply because it has all of the extra, AI ready, VR ready shit plastered all over them, and RGB everywhere, and oversized coolers that aren't necessary, and extra bling and stuff on your motherboard, which is not giving you a better day-to-day usage experience. It's just giving you, wow, look at all the extra knobs and whistles, bells that I have that I'm never gonna use. So it's really easy to kind of get caught up in that and overspend. Regarding a case, that's totally on you. There is a million cases to choose from. Obviously, make sure all your parts fit. Make sure they're from a brand that is got a decent warranty on them. Obviously, whether or not it has a whole bunch of drive storage is depending on if you need a lot of drives. So I think personally, the best sweet spot in price for cases today is about $100. You can get a very well-built, very robust, well-thought-out chassis these days for $100. And back in the day, that would have been considered like a high-end case. But now high-end cases are looking at $150, $200, $250, maybe $300, which again, will be really cool to look at. But unless you've maxed out and min-maxed everywhere else, it makes no sense to buy a super expensive case at the cost of any of your componentry having to be stepped down or limited because you want to buy this really expensive case. So cases are 100% form over function most of the time. You just have to look for things like, if you're going with the eATX motherboard, make sure it supports eATX, that sort of thing. That's oftentimes you can get caught up where an eATX board doesn't fit in your case, and now you're either swapping your board or you're swapping your case. But all right, guys, hopefully this video is giving you some things to consider if you're building a system, especially before we see some potential severe price jumps here. I can tell you, I've seen that the electronic stores and the PC stores are absolutely stocking up their warehouses with pallets floor to ceiling, trying to get in as much stuff ahead of price increases as possible. And so you want to make sure that if you're going to be doing any of this, you also do it before those inventory stockpiles run out. Otherwise, you're going to be paying significantly more for the same amount of performance, and that always sucks. All right, guys, put your best sweet spot recommendations down below, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.